Good morning. Thank you everyone for being here today. We are gathered on traditional Treaty 6 territory, and I'd like to acknowledge the Métis people who share a deep connection with this land. This spring, the UCP government failed to do their jobs, but I want to start on a positive note and recognize the tireless work of my opposition colleagues who definitely did theirs. Every Alberta New Democrat MLA showed up to represent their constituents, to make sure Albertans were heard, and to hold this government accountable. However, over the last few weeks, this government is limiting Albertans' ability to participate democratically and to hold the UCP to account. They introduced many dangerous bills, but two in particular in the last few weeks that compromise our province, Bill 54 and 55. Let's start with Bill 54, the Election Statutes Amendment Act. This bill will make it more difficult for Albertans to cast a ballot. It reopens the door to dark money in politics, and it lowered the referendum thresholds to help push through Danielle Smith's separatist agenda, which completely ignores Alberta's treaty obligations and what Albertans have said they want. Indigenous leaders continue to voice extreme opposition against this UCP's separatist agenda. Then last night, the government forced through Bill 55, the Health Statutes Amendment Act. And that Health Statutes Amendment Act is a bill that can turn hospitals over to private interests, something we know will put our healthcare system at further risk under this UCP government. But that wasn't just the content of the bills that was a problem, it was how they pushed them through. The UCP brought in their anti-democratic agenda, impacting our elections, and then they used anti-democratic tactics to ram it through. Time and time again, they abused their power and their majority through what's called time allocation motions. A time allocation motion limits debate. It lets the UCP run through controversial legislation with as little public awareness as possible. It means Albertans don't know what's happening. It means Albertans don't have time to understand the bill. And it didn't just happen once or twice. The UCP use of time allocation has been unprecedented. And just to put it in perspective, particularly if you were a political nerd, there have been 142 instances of time allocation motion in Alberta's entire history. In the last 6 years, the UCP has used it 71 times. That means half of all time allocation motions in the history of our province have been brought in by the UCP since they took office in 2019. Making the use of time allocation a regular practice is profoundly undemocratic and disrespectful to the Albertans who send us here to debate and improve legislation. So I do want to applaud our Alberta New Democrat team for continuing to fight for Albertans through this session under very frustrating circumstances. Together, we tabled critical amendments to government bills, we introduced meaningful private members' bills, and we demanded accountability from the UCP instead of the chaos they continued to sow in this province. Heading into the session, our top concerns were the rising cost of living, economic fallout from Trump's tariffs, growing challenges in healthcare access, and the state of our education system and public safety. So we came in ready to fight for some of those real problems and to find real solutions to make life more affordable and ensure Albertans could rely on strong public services. What the UCP delivered instead was the largest corruption scandal in Alberta's history, and a government more interested in stoking separatist fires than solving real problems. So we work to hold the government to account on behalf of Albertans who expect their health care to be there when they need it, and their tax dollars to be spent wisely, and their public services to serve people, not special interests. We advocated for workers, we advocated for families, we advocated for affordability, and for a province that puts people before politics. And it's safe to say we were met with a lot of resistance from this UCP government. We brought forward some common sense solutions like Bill 210, legislation that would ensure workers keep their tips. But the UCP wouldn't even allow it to be debated or move on into committee of the whole stage. They didn't offer amendments, they didn't try to make it better, they just said no, because they would rather play bipartisan games rather than help hardworking Albertans. On the corrupt care scandal, something we talked a lot about, a series of revelations showed that one company has been overpaid and has underdelivered multiple times, a company with very close ties to members of the UCP cabinet. The government knows the only way out is to call a full public inquiry, but they do not do that. So we are left waiting the conclusions of investigations that began in the spring sitting that the government has carefully crafted and constrained. We don't really expect them to deliver real answers. Without a public inquiry, we will continue to hold the government to account for this scandal. We will continue to ask questions along with members of the media who have been watching this closely. If there was nothing to hide, there would be no reason to fear transparency. But the UCP have voted against transparency. They voted for cover-ups, and repeatedly we see them voting against affordability and refusing to take any accountability in the legislature. They also introduced a budget that did nothing for Albertans, cut critical services, failed to plan for any of the challenges ahead. We spent a lot of time debating that. We saw low-income disabled Albertans will particularly feel the loss of the new $200 federal benefit, which the UCP, as the only province in all of Canada, has cruelly decided to snatch back from AISH recipients. So they are taking $200 a month out of the wallets of disabled folks. That's where the Danielle Smith government is at. No one else is doing this. The budget was cruel. It contained cuts, chaos, and corruption, and didn't properly serve Albertans. And the Premier lost a caucus member over it. The government has shown no interest in working across the aisle for the benefits of Albertans. Since taking office, the UCP has refused to pass any single private member's bill from the opposition. In contrast, they pass every single private member's bill brought forward by a UCP MLA. And for perspective, maybe that's typical. I can tell you it's not. Under the Alberta NDP government, private members' bills were passed from across both parties across the political spectrum, 2 from the UCP MLAs, 2 from PCs, 1 from the Wild Rose, 1 from an independent, and 3 from NDP members. So this stonewalling is not reasonable, it's not normal, and Albertans deserve a government that plays well with others. A government that believes in the principles of democracy. A government that respects good ideas, no matter where they come from. And Albertans deserve better than a UCP government that keeps putting partisanship ahead of progress. That was a lot, but I feel very strongly about this. I'm going to turn it over to Naheed Nenshi.
I've been in this job for almost a year now, and yet folks still think that I can summarize what Christina said in a shorter way than Christina said it. I can't do that. But I will tell you one thing. It is hard to imagine a premier that has a worse legislative session in Alberta history than the legislative session Danielle Smith has had over the last few months. Mired in corruption, completely focused on cover-up, unable to do anything that actually makes a difference for Albertans. So as you heard from Christina, this government is just focused on political games. They're focused on political games and maneuvering in order to try and make their image look better. So what we have, the worst scandal in Alberta's history. Let me just highlight one thing. We learned late in the session that the Minister of Justice, who has stood up every single day to defend the government in the corrupt care scandal, is the cousin of the fan at the center of the scandal. It's his wife's cousin. In any other province, that one fact alone would destroy a government. And it's just another thing that the Premier pretends doesn't matter. Her answer was, well, should he divorce his wife? No. But how about not giving $1 billion in government contracts to a guy with no experience who happens to be related to the Justice Minister's wife? How about the Justice Minister recusing himself? How about the Justice Minister telling the public and his own government that he happens to be related to the guy who's getting billions of dollars in taxpayer money for shoddy goods? How about that? Yet, the Premier says it's no big deal. Premier, it's a frickin' big deal. It is a big deal because it shows the incredible depths of corruption of your government. This government in this busy session did not one thing to decrease the cost of living for Albertans. In fact, They raise taxes and fees across the board. Your property taxes are going up more than any mayor could ever dream of increasing your property taxes. And they pretended that's just not happening. They sent flyers saying, we're saving you $2 a day. But in reality, that $2 a day pales in comparison to the fees, taxes, and levies that they've increased across the province. And as Christina said, it's particularly bad if you're poor and you're disabled. In that case, after years of advocacy, the disability community finally convinced the federal government to give them a pittance, to give them $200 a month. And the Alberta government, uniquely among all provinces, is taking the $200 back. Because for them, it's just $200. They don't think that for someone living on the margins, $200 means a little less fear when you're at the till at the grocery store. $200 means maybe you're going to make it to the end of the month without having to borrow money from family or friends. $200 means you're not going to worry about being evicted this month. $200 means, hey, maybe you get to go see that new Marvel movie. This is all about dignity. And the UCP is cruel on purpose. Cruelty is the plan for them. So they haven't done a thing to address cost of living. The healthcare system, despite the Premier's protestations, has gotten worse and worse and worse. Wait times for surgeries have increased. Public operating rooms remain empty while the staff are forced to work in private surgical centres that cost way more than the public operations would have. And by the way, some of those centres run by UCP insiders and friends who have no experience in delivering these services. They haven't done one thing for education. Teachers are about to go on strike. Classrooms remain large, complex, overcrowded, and there is no respect for the public education system. And they haven't done a thing to sustain jobs. The Dow chemical plant, the one and only mega project announced under the UCP, is now delayed, perhaps indefinitely. And so, the Premier, in a desperate attempt to change the channel, introduced a series of bills at the end of the term, which they rammed through without debate. And this is what they do. They make it harder for you to vote. They ensure that your duly elected city councils and school board trustees have no code of conduct and no code of ethics under which they operate. In fact, they made it illegal for city and town councils to have a code of conduct for elected officials. They've introduced privatization to the healthcare system in a way Ralph Klein never would have dreamed of. Those of you who remember Ralph Klein's Bill 11, you will remember there were months and months of debate and public engagement before the Premier actually withdrew it, saying Albertans don't support it. They rammed through Bill 55 in one late night sitting in the parliamentary session. And they have stacked the rules of democracy in municipal and provincial elections to give them and only them an unlimited flow of dark money in order to be able to buy elections. Not a single Albertan voted for this. This was not in their platform. This is not anything they talked about. Yet this is what they do. And, most troubling, in a desperate attempt to save her own job, which she admitted, because sometimes she says the quiet part out loud, in a desperate attempt to save her own job, the Premier is gambling with the very future of our country. She's brought separatism to the fore, and Premier, we're smarter than that. You can say, oh, it wasn't me, it's those people, they're doing it. But when you show up at a fundraiser where your EDA president is also the leader of the independence movement and you praise him for his work, when you pass legislation to make it easier to have a separatism referendum, Premier, here's the thing. You think Albertans are stupid. You think you're so smart. You think that you can pull anything over on them. Albertans are way smarter than you give them credit for. We know exactly what game you're playing. We know the dangerous stakes of this game, and we are not going to allow you to tear our country apart. In the meantime, they refuse to call by-elections, leaving the people of Edmonton-Strathcona without a representative for nearly 6 months. The hypocrisy of this Premier is extraordinary, because remember, she herself would not run in Calgary-Elbow because she thought she would lose, and held the people of that riding without representation for 9 months because they don't believe in democracy. They haven't called a by-election in Edmonton-Ellerslie despite having a candidate for a long time. And we have yet another vacancy. And politically, you cannot imagine a worse outcome for a premier than when you have a 6-seat majority losing 2 of your caucus members because they think you are unethical and corrupt. So I can't imagine a worse session for any premier than the session this premier has had. And we see her desperation play out every single day in her desperate attempts to change the channel, in her desperate attempts to save her own skin, in her rationalization for separatism, saying, if I don't do it, I might lose the next election. Albertans deserve better. Albertans deserve a government that wants to govern. Albertans deserve a premier who knows how to lead. We have none of those things right now. And Albertans, this summer, hopefully, you will get the chance to send a message to Danielle Smith. You'll get a chance to send her a message in Edmonton-Strathcona, in Southeast Edmonton, in Edmonton-Ellerslie, and in Olds Didsbury Three Hills. Let's send her the message that Alberta deserves better, and better is possible. We'll take questions.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Just a reminder to those of you who are on Zoom, all you need to do is raise your hand and we'll get to your question. We're going to start in the room with Cindy Tran from the Edmonton Journal.
Hi, thanks so much for taking my questions. This is for the House Leader. In regards to Bill 54, you called it dangerous. Rocky Pancholi, when asked about the amendments that were coming to it at INS yesterday, had said that it wouldn't do anything. I'm just wondering what the Alberta NDP's next steps are in addressing concerns with Bill 54, and especially because we're going to see a couple demonstrations today, and there was also the Onion Lake press conference as well.
Absolutely. So I'll start, but I think our leader Naheed Nenshi would be good on this as well. So you are going to see demonstrations today because the opposition to Bill 54 has not gone away. And I want to be really clear about Bill 54. Not only have First Nations demanded that it be fully repealed because of the attack on their treaty rights and obligations, but also the Chief Electoral Officer and the former Elections Commissioner both wrote letters outlining how it would undermine people's ability to engage in elections, how it would undermine access, how it would undermine investigations. And the majority of the complaints that have been raised and levied against Bill 54 were not resolved, addressed in any way. And Bill 54 received, I believe it was less than 5 hours of debate across less than 2 weeks because it was introduced so late in the session. It's bad legislation. It brings back corporate and union donations, something that when the NDP banned it, all parties voted for. And so the opposition to this bill will continue in different forms. Protests, I think we will see. Court challenges are expected. How the government chooses to react to that, we'll have to wait and see. But let me invite Naheed.
Yeah, thanks, Christina. To be clear, Alberta's New Democrats stand with Indigenous people. We stand with democracy advocates. We stand with Albertans. So, you know, the Premier, sometimes in her flights of fancy, likes to call herself the most freedom-loving politician in the history of the world. And all she does is systematically strip away people's freedoms. And with Bill 54, she strips away your democratic voting rights. She strips away your ability to vote if your house was destroyed in a fire. She strips away the rights of students to be able to vote when they're away at school in their home constituencies. And fundamental voting rights are sacred as far as I'm concerned. She also is playing fast and loose with Indigenous rights. So today, I believe, I wasn't there, but I believe the Onion Lake First Nation today reaffirmed their commitment to fighting the Alberta Sovereignty Act in court. We've always known the Alberta Sovereignty Act is blatantly unconstitutional. And I hope that the courts will find that soon. Perhaps the Onion Lake case will be the one that allows them to do that. We've always known that. We've always known that it violates the Charter of Rights and Freedoms and strips away people's freedoms. I think the Premier knows that. Bill 54 also has a number of deeply troubling pieces in it that take away people's fundamental voting rights and that threaten Indigenous rights. So I expect we will see a number of legal challenges, and I expect that the government will have to figure out if they want to waste yet more taxpayers' money. It should
be done in a parliamentary way, in a respectful way. It's an ongoing conversation, and there are good days and bad days when it comes to quorum. It certainly came up a number of times this session, such that Speaker Cooper has started an initiative to talk about perhaps a member-to-member or MLA-to-MLA code of conduct or anti-harassment policy to make sure that we have proper mechanisms, because you don't always think of it that way, but for 87 people, this is their workplace. And I will say it's a unique workplace. Standing up to ask questions while there's a wall of noise of people yelling at you, very unusual workplace. So we need to talk about it. It's a unique workplace. What do we need to be doing to behave in a way that we can all do our jobs, represent Albertans, and get home safely?
I'm going to jump in on that too, if you don't mind. So I'm still new to this world, and I don't sit in that house, but I do watch it. And when I took this job, I told my own members that we can lead by example, and we can be better in the House than we have been. So in the fall, we didn't heckle at all. And we were responded with a wall of noise, derision, insults, particularly towards female and racialized members of my caucus, over and over and over again. This term, we played it a little looser, but my caucus operates under some pretty strict rules around their own behavior and their own decorum. They're trying not to let those folks, those bullies, get under their skin. And it's very clear that the UCP operates under no such rules.
Emmanuel Prince Tove from RCI.
Hey, you said it was the worst sitting in Premier's history of Alberta, you know, but they still delivered on some key promises on their part, such as the tax cut in the budget, and also what they call the Compassionate Care Act on mental health and addiction. So how can you be so conclusive that this was the worst sitting ever if they did indeed fill their most important election promise, which was a tax cut?
That's a fair question. I wouldn't argue it was their most important election promise, but I will tell you that of all of the bills that they put forth in the legislature this year, those were the only two they ever talked about in the election. And they did a number of things that they either never talked about or previously said they were opposed to. So legislatively, they got in a tiny tax cut while increasing property taxes for many people by more than the amount of that tax cut. But at the same time, in so doing, they went from a $6 billion surplus to at least a $5 billion deficit, which will probably be $10 to $15 billion. So if you voted Conservative because they're good with money, they're not. I have never seen a fiscal turnaround that big caused entirely by a government's waste and inaction on the budget. So they tabled one of the worst budgets I've ever seen. No investment in schools, not a single school has a single amount of construction funding under their school accelerator program. No further investment in healthcare facilities, no further investment in public transit or roads. And yes, a tiny, tiny tax cut, $2 a day, $2 a day. Almost enough to buy you a coffee at Tim Hortons, but in return, a massive increase in fees, levies, and property taxes. So even on what they promised to deliver, they gave with one hand and took away with the other. Compassionate care, look, I'll give it to them. They delivered it. And we know that under the UCP, the number of people who have unfortunately died due to drug poisoning has reached record levels. It's going down a little bit now, but it's going down everywhere. Nothing to do with the UCP. And they haven't managed to build more than, is it 3 recovery centers out of 11? 3 out of 11 have been built. And their Compassionate Care Act relies on projects being built that haven't even been tendered, that haven't even been designed. So it's going to be years and years and years before their involuntary treatment will actually take place at a time when so many hundreds and thousands of Albertans are waiting for voluntary treatment. So even on the two things, the only two things, promises that they tried to fulfill, they didn't really fulfill either.
And I know you've talked, both of you, about a lot of issues, but what, in your mind, is the most important issue or policy that was on the agenda this session?
I think that for me, it comes down to the incompetence and corruption of this government. It plays through in every single thing they do. They don't care about governing. They don't care about building a better Alberta. They care about winning another election. And we see that in everything they do. And the fact that the Premier so breezily dismisses corruption, so breezily dismisses political interference, so breezily dismisses alleged bloated contracts, means that to her, this stuff doesn't matter. I think it matters. I think taxpayers, first of all, don't want you to see them wasting money. They don't want to see people get preferential treatment. They don't believe in unfairness. And the reason that they're so corrupt is because they don't know what they're doing. If they were competent governors, then at least they could point to their record, but they have no good record to point to. So all they can do is try and change the channel and make sure that as long as they're in power, themselves, their friends, and their insiders get all the spoils of that power. Do you want to say anything?
I think there's some really deep concerns around the privatization of healthcare, particularly around Bill 55, that because of time allocation and because it was introduced so late in the session, really haven't been able to be unpacked. And in a province where 1 million people can't get a family doctor, there were 34,000 hours of ER closures this past year. The wait times when you do get to an ER and the empty operating rooms, like just the healthcare system in its state is something I hear about constantly from constituents in Melwoods, and I think that was a really critical
It's okay,
issue.
you're getting a South Edmonton hospital nearby.
Yeah, no, we're not. It's frustrating. It's really frustrating, and I suspect voters in Edmonton Ellerslie will be asking about that South Edmonton hospital.
But they can just drive to Red Deer. That's what the Premier said.
Driving to Red Deer. So the question was, what's the kind of top priority? I think healthcare was a really important one, and of course that touches on the corrupt care scandal as well because of the expansion of private surgical centres and the way that that's been happening, which is undermining the healthcare system and delivering worse results.
Catherine Krakowski, Alberta Today.
Yeah, so sort of picking up on that topic, a lot of the oxygen was taken up by what you have dubbed corrupt care and this referendum, and there was less time to talk about actual lawmaking. So I'm wondering, what are your plans for continuation of debate outside of the House, and are you hopeful that things will be like Klein and they'll have a change of heart after they have a chance to hear from people? What's the plan?
Well, you know, we do have these 3 by-elections coming up, and I suspect these by-elections will be a wake-up call for the UCP about just how unpopular their agenda has been. I also expect that the Premier, having lost 2 caucus members, will be spending the summer making sure she doesn't lose 4 more. And I think there is an absolutely non-zero chance that we will come back in the fall with a minority government. And so if these things start to happen, the Premier's position becomes very tenuous. And we know the history of the Conservative movement over the last 2 decades in this province has been that they eat their own. So if I'm the Premier today, I am deeply worried about my future as leader of this party, or frankly, about the future of my party. And you know what? She deserves it. Because here's the thing about the Conservative movement in Alberta. Regardless of at a moment in history whether they're a little more right or they're a little more left or they're a little more centrist, what Peter Lougheed was able to deliver to Albertans, even what Ralph Klein was able to deliver to Albertans, is competent government. That Albertans could see what they were for and what they were trying to do. And they were able to live with Ralph Klein's cuts to healthcare and education because they thought we've got to balance the budget. But right now we have a government that can't balance the budget and is destroying public services and presiding over an economy that is collapsing around us. People can't go to the grocery store without a pang of fear. They're worried about the cost of their rent. And one of the most interesting things that happened this year is that the government gave you a little bit of a tax refund, but they increased property taxes, which means your rent and your cost of living if you own your home is going up at a time where we have a housing affordability crisis. So I strongly suspect that as the Premier is on the barbecue circuit this summer, she's going to get an earful about referendum, about separation, and about her government's super failed record. So I suspect if they have any self-esteem or pride or integrity, we will see a very chastened government come back here in the fall. I don't think it will happen. I think their arrogance will overcome any humility that they might have after what they hear this summer.
Okay, and you mentioned that barbecue circuit and the by-election, so it's not going to be the typical barbecue circuit, because we have those by-elections, we are expecting an interim report on Judge Wine's investigation. And we're also expecting, not sure the size of it, but at least one new cabinet minister appointed. So I'm wondering how big of a change will we see in the critic roles or House teams, depending on any cabinet shuffle and the outcome of the by-elections?
I was really looking forward to a half day off this long weekend. I have been salivating for my Saturday morning off, and I strongly suspect that I may not get it. So this is not summer vacation for any of us. The work starts now. We'll see many of you at Nagarkirtan here in Edmonton on Sunday. But we've got a ton of work to do. We're expecting a cabinet shuffle tomorrow. We have no idea how big that will be. We have no idea if the Premier will actually fire the two most incompetent members of her cabinet, Adriana LaGrange and Mickey Amory, or shuffle them at the very least. I mean, any normal government would do that, but we don't have a normal government. As for our team, we've got a strong team. I'm very, very proud of the 36 MLAs who stand up for Albertans every single day and look after their shadow ministries with such care and compassion. Now, of course, after the by-elections, when we win all three of them, inshallah, knock on wood, we will have to shuffle a little bit, but we'll wait until the by-elections happen before we do any of that. And, you know, I will say that the one I've been the most disappointed with, of course, in our caucus is the Leader of the Opposition. And I am really hoping that I'll be able to have her replaced before the end of the summer.
We're going to go to Zoom now. Janet French from, sorry? Shaylin Skulski.
I feel like I should have explained
CTV,
that joke,
please.
but I think you all got it. I got it. You got it.
Go ahead, Shaylin.
So much for taking my question. It is for Ninchi. We're hearing a lot about a division and anger in this province right now, whether it's separation groups that are seeking independence, or we heard from the First Nation groups launching legal challenges just this morning, as well as rallies expected this afternoon. I guess I'm just wondering what concerns you might have about the future of this province in regards to unity.
Yeah, you know, Jen Gerson wrote a really good piece in The Line about this in the last 24 hours, and it really echoes much of what I've been saying. If you're a politician who stokes anger, fear, and division, that's like eating a sugary snack. You'll feel good for a moment, but it's not going to sustain you. And eventually, you will not be able to control it. So I remember when former Premier Jason Kenney said, the quote, "the lunatics are taking over the asylum," unquote. What I said to him in return was, the arsonist, the person who lit the match, waives the right to call the fire department. So basically, we have a Premier who is one of three things. Either she doesn't understand the impact of the fear and division that she stokes every single day, or she thinks she's smarter than all of us, and certainly smarter than Jason Kenney was, and she can control it to her own advantage, or she just wants to watch the world burn. Those are the only three reasons that a politician would act in the way she's acting. And we got a lot of work to do, because we do better when we're unified. We do better when we are proud, strong Albertans in a proud, strong Canada. And if you just keep making people angry at one another, if you keep giving them scapegoats to blame, that is no recipe for a society that works. And the reason Alberta works as well as it does, and I've said it for so many years, is that we're a place that welcomes everyone. That it doesn't matter who your daddy is or what your last name is or where you went to school. What matters is what's in your head, what are your ideas, and what's your willingness to work hard to make them happen. That's Alberta. That's what keeps us going in the middle of the frozen prairie. And for the Premier to take that away, to tell people that a province where you didn't get a barn built unless your neighbors came over to build the barn is one where you have to fear and mistrust and be angry at your neighbors, whether they live here or in Ontario or Quebec, is no recipe for success. It's never worked in human history. And I hope that the Premier spends some time reflecting and reading and thinking this summer and understanding that her path can only lead to ruin.
On that note, then, I guess, in regards to the plans for this summer, we know the Premier plans to set out as chair of this new Alberta Next panel. So what is your message, I suppose, to Albertans as make their voices heard about this division in the state of our province?
It's a really important question you're asking, and I know a lot of Albertans are asking themselves, do I want to stand up now? Do I want to speak out for Canada and speak out against this government now? Or do I want to sit back, avoid trouble, and hope that this all passes over? But what we saw in the Brexit referendum, and Premier Smith is certainly following David Cameron's script to a T, is that if people don't stand up for what's good and for what's right, it never happens. So yes, she's convening another one of her endless panels, which she will stock with endless cronies and insiders who will get paid endless amounts of taxpayer money to come up with endless reports that people ignore. And yes, if you go to those panels and you say you're wrong, they will ignore you. But you know what? Go anyway. Show up anyway. Speak passionately about the Alberta you love anyway. Because let's start finding our voices. Let's let the silent majority of Albertans not be silent anymore and talk about why we love this country and why this is important to us. And all this talk of getting out of the Canada Pension Plan or setting up an Alberta Police Service, none of that is going to make life better for Albertans, and none of that is going to improve the quality of the place we love. And in fact, the Premier is putting the very existence of Canada at risk, and we need to tell her that's not acceptable.
Thank you, Shay. We have time for one more question. Janet French from CBC.
Hi there. We heard some folks speculating that Danielle Smith is setting the stage for an early provincial election call in 2026. Do you want an early election call in 2026, and why or why not?
We're ready. We're ready now. And we'd be happy to take it. We'd be happy to let Albertans get rid of this government and throw it on its ear once and for all. But that said, she's just doing this because she's sowing chaos. She thinks this will keep us unsteady, keep us off our feet. Do what you want, Premier. We stand here for Albertans. And you know, on one day you leak rumors that you're going to have a snap election this summer. The next day you do a political statement to the province in which you say we'll have a referendum next summer. The next day you leak stories to the press that we'll have a general election next summer before a referendum. Sometimes we hear that there'll be a general election along with the referendum. Premier, play all the games you want. It keeps you from doing more damage. But honestly, we're not here to play games. We have a fixed election date. We are happy to run on the fixed election date. If you call an election first, we'll beat you in that one. So do what you want.
My follow-up is this Republican Party of Alberta. Some people might say that the UCP is worried that this presents a division for Conservatives again. How much of an opportunity do you think this Republican independence, whatever movement, offers the UP to capitalize on?
So I'm going to give you a very inside politics answer first and then a broader answer. Watch to see when the Old Didsbury Three Hills election is called. That will tell you how nervous the UCP is about the Alberta Republican Party. The Speaker mentioned that he was going to stay in his job until early June. If they call the election before that and the Speaker resigns before that, it means they're doing it because they don't want the Republican Party to be organized in Old Didsbury Three Hills, which I will remind you is the only riding that's ever elected a separatist MLA. It's also, by the way, where Pierre Poilievre is running, so there's a bunch of fun political stories here. So that's the inside politics story. You will know how scared they are by how they deal with the Old Didsbury Three Hills by-election. I will also tell you that if I'm the Premier, I'm not worried about 2 political parties on the right. I'm worried about 3 political parties on the right. Because Peter Guthrie and Scott Sinclair aren't joining the Republican Party of Alberta. And if you heard Scott Sinclair in the legislature this week laying out a very principled case for what conservatism really is, that's what I'd be sweating about. That the Premier taking over a united party will actually lead to the birth of 3 Conservative parties. Pop the popcorn. The Alberta New Democrats are ready to stand for our values and to stand for real Albertans.
That concludes the news conference, everyone. Thank you for participating. Take care.